Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk with you. Now, before I jump in, I have to give the caveat, I am not a physician, I am a researcher, so a lot of the really wonderful medical knowledge that we've been given, I can't give you advice on that. What I study is communication, so I'm really interested in how we manage our relationships through talk and through communication. And so that is kind of the lens I'm going to be bringing today. I'll also just give a brief plug. I have some handouts here that is just an infographic that is kind of like a summary of these findings. You're welcome to take those. I'm also actively recruiting family caregivers for my dissertation research right now. So if you know family caregivers, if you are a family caregiver, if you're interested, there's also a stack of flyers about that over there. So help yourself. But let's go ahead and jump in. So to get started, I want to give a little bit, again, because I'm a researcher, I have to give you the scholarly background. And to give you kind of an idea of where this is a specific project I worked on, some research I conducted for my master's thesis at the University of Arizona in the Department of Communication. And I kind of have come to end of life and Alzheimer's disease and dementia and family caregiving from a little bit of my lived experiences, watching my grandparents age and move towards the end of their lifespan, but also just from very much of I am interested in relationships, and dementia is a really challenging relational situation. And there's a lot that we don't fully understand or that people don't know as they're approaching dementia. And so that's kind of what was driving me, is I wanted to know what happens when your spouse gets dementia, and how does that affect the relationship, and what can we do about it? So, of course, I went to the academic literature first, and there's some really interesting themes in that literature. The first theme is this idea of relational challenge or decline that can occur as the symptoms of the disease come upon the person. So there's talk of loss of intimacy, loss of deep conversations, loss of being able to rely on the person to do the things they used to. So that's really challenging, hard, kind of a theme of loss. There's also this theme in the literature talking about ongoing connection or closeness in dementia. And I found this really fascinating. How can we have this really challenging relational decline or loss happening and this continuing connection, love, and care? So that's what I wanted to know a little bit about, was how are these things happening? We also find in the literature that there's a lot of caregiving family members make big efforts to maintain closeness or connection with their loved one who has dementia. And so there's these ongoing efforts to maintain closeness. And as a communication scholar, I thought, oh, that's where communication is. That's what we've got to dig in on. So the things that were guiding this project, two research questions. One was, how do marital relationships change over the course of dementia? How do they change? What happens in these relationships? As well as, what role does communication between the partners play in kind of helping maintain that connection or that closeness despite some really challenging symptoms of the disease? So what I did was I used what's called relational turning points to look at the change in these relationships. Now, a relational turning point is an event or an experience that serves to change the relationship in some way. So if you think about a dating relationship, it's really easy to pick out those turning points. First date, that's probably a turning point that changes the nature of the relationship. First kiss, probably a turning point that changes the nature of the relationship. First time you say I love you, that's a change, right? Here's another relational turning point. A proposal to marriage, that's a relational turning point. We even changed the name of our relationships after that turning point from boyfriend, girlfriend to fiance, right? So it's really common to have these turning points in our relationships. And relational turning points are really helpful because they can help us see not just these moments of change, but also a trajectory of change or broader patterns of change that occur in a relationship. So I wanted to take this idea of relational turning points and move it into the dementia space. What are these moments that change the nature of our relationships once a loved one is starting to show the symptoms of dementia? So I use what's called retrospective interviewing, and this is a specific type of interviewing where you have the person create a timeline of their relational events. So they map out all the turning points that have occurred, and then this map, this timeline that they create, gives a view of what is the relational trajectory. It can also give us insight into what is the communication that's kind of going on around these turning points. So that's kind of what I did. Oh, and that was the starting point for in-depth interviews. So these were just conversations. I sat down with spousal caregivers. We talked usually for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and we talked about all the turning points they had experienced, the changes they were experiencing, as well as the communication. What were they talking about? How were they interacting with their spouse with dementia? So this is the map. This is what I gave to the people I talked to. So they mapped out starting with the first awareness of symptoms all the way to the present moment that they were at in the disease. And then I had them map turning points that made them feel closer to their partner, moving towards the top of the page, and those that made them feel more distant, moving towards the bottom of the page, to give us kind of an idea of, okay, there's a change in your relationship. How is that change impacting the way you feel about your partner, about your relationship? So let me give you an idea of who I talked to. So I talked to 18 spousal caregivers, and this is kind of a lot to look at. So I want to first draw your attention to this column. This is the diagnosis of the spouse. So there was a lot of people who their spouse was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, early onset Alzheimer's, as well as I had a few that we've titled unspecified dementia. These were people who their spouse refused to get testing. So they knew they had dementia of some kind, but they didn't know the specific diagnosis. So like Dr. Self talked about, the diagnosis is really important, and that was an important piece for a lot of these spouses, and we'll talk a little more about that. I also want to draw your attention to this column, which is the length of the disease. So one of the things I asked them was, how long have you been living, how long has your spouse been living with dementia? So most of this is length of time since the diagnosis, but some of them, it was more like length of time since they kind of felt the onset of dementia. So you'll notice there's a pretty wide range here. I had some people, if you look at the top, the first participant, her husband had only been living with dementia for a year. Whereas some of them, they've been living with this for 10 years. So I had people with a lot of experience, people who were right in the middle of it, people who were just starting, and all of them were mapping out these turning points for me. So let me show you kind of what these timelines looked at. This is one participant, I've named her Jane. This is her timeline, and I know the handwriting can be a little hard to read, but you can see she's starting out with minor little things happening. The diagnosis was a turning point for them. Here, kind of in the middle of the trajectory, a lot of stuff about driving, which we've talked about, as well as forgetting how to do some household things. Moving to memory care being a big turning point. And then her husband actually died right before the interview, within a few months. And so you can see here, even at the end, there's some really major memory loss of forgetting who the spouse was. So she has a really challenging run, and you can almost kind of see that. Like I said, you can see the trajectory of relational change. We can see a little bit of relational decline. But you can also see she makes some notes here at the top about an open conversation they had, and also about his personality and the way he was still sweet and loving. So this is one. Let me show you another one that's right in the middle. This is a participant I named Tom. His handwriting is quite hard to read from a distance, so don't worry if you can't read all of it. But he starts out by, again, indicating some early symptoms. She wasn't able to complete her work and lost her job. Then she was diagnosed, and sexual relations had ended just right before our interview. These interviews were conducted in early 2020, so the last one he has on 2019. But his timeline is interesting, and I actually have multiple people who did this. He wrote a note down here that says, none of these things have made the relationship truly more distant, which I thought was really interesting, again, with this idea of losses in the relationship and continued connection or love in the relationship. And I had multiple people who wrote a little note like that to me on their timelines. So after they made their little timelines, we sat down and did the interview. Once I got all the interviews together and all the timelines, I did some analysis looking for themes across. So what were the common turning points, what were the common relational changes, and what were the common relational strategies, communication strategies. And this is what I found. This is kind of a lot. This is the master timeline. So this is kind of the summary of the 9 most common turning points, which we'll talk about, as well as the 4 broad relational changes that seem to occur for most of these caregiving spouses. Now, some of them I'll say, not everyone had this because not everyone was as far in the disease trajectory, but this seems to be kind of the common disease trajectory. So what I want to do is I'm going to zoom in on each of these relational changes, talk to you about these turning points, and then we'll talk a little bit about the communication that they relied on as well. So let's start here with the first turning points that occurred in the relationship. And now I titled this change, My Spouse Has Dementia. Having the realization that their spouse had dementia for most people was a big change in their relationship. And it started with the first turning point of experiencing the initial symptoms and then receiving a diagnosis. Both of these kind of contributed to this relational change. So I'm going to give you quotes from my participants. As a qualitative researcher, it's important for me to give their voices less than mine. So I'm going to share the way they talked about it to kind of give you an idea of what each of these turning points look like. So the first one was experiencing initial symptoms. For most of these caregiving spouses, the initial symptoms were really frustrating. They were really confusing and really hard because all of a sudden their spouse was behaving differently and they didn't know why. This is probably ringing a lot of bells. There was a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration. So Emily recalled feeling a little unconfident in her relationship because of the changes she was noticing. She said, "It breaks down confidence in your partner when they are suddenly behaving in a way that's peculiar and not their usual self." So this pre-diagnosis stage relationally is really challenging, and I think this kind of, I think I can echo Dr. Self here that the diagnosis is important because it gives some clarity. So medically, diagnosis is important. Relationally, the diagnosis was really important too. So that was the next turning point, was receiving the diagnosis. Eleanor said that her wife's behavior started making more sense after the diagnosis, and she said, "I think that helped the relationship. It kind of brought us a little closer together." So the diagnosis is really beneficial for getting you the treatment or the care you need, but for these caregiving spouses, the diagnosis was sort of like a revelation, like, aha, I understand why my spouse is behaving this way. So it resolved a lot of confusion and allowed them to think about their spouse's behavior in a way that allowed them to adapt and not just get angry or not just be frustrated. So many of them talked about the diagnosis being actually something that kind of moved their relationship a bit closer after being strained by initial symptoms. And so if you look back here, I actually indicate by moving this turning point a little bit up. For most caregiving spouses, that was a little bit of like a moment of closeness in their relationship when they were able to receive a diagnosis. Okay, so now let's highlight this section and talk a little bit about this change from spouse to caregiver. Pretty much all of the caregiving spouses I talked about this change, where they felt like they were moving from having this spousal relationship to a caregiver care recipient relationship. And there were 4 turning points that kind of contributed to this relational change. The first one was losing driving privileges. So we have talked so much about driving, and for caregiving spouses, driving was a huge sticking point. This was a big challenge, as you know. Actually, I'm not going to have that up so I can read it to you. But so the problem with driving, obviously, it's unsafe. They feel like they need to be stepping in. But the act of stepping in and monitoring their spouse's behavior didn't feel very spousey. So they would say things like, "I just didn't feel like I was a spouse anymore. I felt like I was a caregiver because I had to take away the keys, or I had to stop them from driving, or I had to control their behavior in some way." And controlling behavior wasn't a very spousely behavior. So having to step in and have this conversation, while it was important and necessary for safety, it also shifted the nature of the relationship in some ways, because they were stepping into a realm that wasn't very spousely. They were doing these behaviors that didn't feel like spouse kind of behavior or conversation. So I'm going to share an example from Jane, and she talked about one of these conversations with her husband and how it shifted this relationship for her. She said, "I couldn't trust him not to break the car by doing something that was careless. I felt like I was talking to a teenager. There was, what happened? What were you doing? What were you thinking? What on earth were you thinking? Very motherly." And that's when I felt the shift was. I became his mother. And sometimes that punitive mother who was about ready to ground him. And a big change. I went from his wife, his partner to mother. So you can see these conversations, while being essential for safety, an important thing that we need to be having, they also serve to change the relationship, because she went from partner equals to mother to monitoring or controlling her spouse's behavior. The next turning point that contributed to this change from spouse to caregiver was changing household roles and responsibilities. The caregiving spouses talked to me about the ways that in a marriage relationship they expected to be interdependent and to be able to rely on each other. So they were used to sharing household responsibilities. You know, he takes care of this, she takes care of that. Together we get everything done and we rely on each other to do things. Now, when the spouse who had dementia started losing their ability to fulfill all of those roles, that felt like a change in the marriage relationship, because they could no longer rely on their partner in the way they had previously. So Emily said, with your spouse, you've been so reliant on them. There's so much push-pull between the two of you. There's that push-pull, and suddenly it's physics. The push or pull simply goes away, and there you are. You are simply thrown into caregiving. You recognize that the relationship is no longer a marital one, it's one of caregiving. So again, this loss of being able to rely on their spouse was one of these things that kind of changed the nature of the relationship. It wasn't just that their spouse was sick or had different symptoms, but the loss of being able to count on them in the way that they had previously. The next turning point that contributed to this change was feeling less romantic. Now, I'll say not every care partnership had this turning point. This was some and not everyone. But many of the caregiving spouses talked about romance being an important part of the marital relationship. Being married includes some aspect of romance for many people. And so when their spouse stopped being able to engage romantically, that was a change in their relationship. Tom said, she just can't seem to even think in a sexual way anymore. I love her dearly, but removing intimacy, it eliminates an important component of the relationship. And so for many of them, they recognize this is the disease, this is normal, but losing the intimate, romantic side of the relationship was another thing that shifted their relationship from a spousal relationship to more of a caregiving relationship. Joni added, she said, I'm feeling less and less romantic as I'm being more and more of a caretaker. And so we see as the symptoms of the disease are changing the partner's ability to engage in different ways, it's shifting the relationship for their care partner, for the caregiving spouse. The final turning point that contributed to this change from spouse to caregiver was experiencing increasingly severe symptoms. So for many of these caregiving spouses, they would tell me about the progression of the disease, and they'd say, we'd be going along, and then there'd be a change. We'd be going along, then there'd be a change. And so when a new symptom would appear, that would create a new turning point, another additional change in the relationship. So again, not a medical professional, I don't know how common it is for a really gradual decline to occur, but the way most of these spouses talked, it seemed like something new happens, and now we're at a new level. Now something new happens, and now we're at a new level. And so they kind of mapped these new symptoms, new severe symptoms, as specific relational turning points. Tom said, there just came a point where the symptoms overtook her ability to control her own moods and her own routine. It became really clear that I needed to become the caregiver. And Tom, like some of the other caregivers, he shared a specific example of a new symptom that they noticed. His wife has very, very curly hair, and he mentioned at one point, he said, why do you keep wearing your hair in a ponytail? It's so boring. And she pulled it up, and it was like a dreadlock, like she hadn't been caring for it and he hadn't realized. And so this was a turning point for him where he realized, oh, there's so much more care that needs to be done. And so when a new symptom would appear, and for many, like Tom, they had kind of these moments where they're like, oh, this is a new thing. It would just further move the relationship towards being a caregiver and less of a spouse in the way they were thinking about themselves. So the third relationship change I want to talk about is this idea of my spouse is gone. This is really challenging relational change that I'll say not all of the caregiving spouses experienced. Many of those who were near the end of the trajectory, who've been living with dementia for a really long time in their relationships, experienced this. And the participants that I talked to who had lost their spouse a few months prior, many of them had some of these turning points occurred for them. So this is, I think, the most challenging part. But it occurred through 3 turning points of losing intimate conversations, altering living arrangements, and forgetting my name, which is really challenging. So let me go through those. So the first relationship change was losing intimate conversations. Caregiving spouses talked about the way that conversation with their spouse was central to who they were, to their friendship, to the way they engaged. They relied on that conversation. It was a regular, ongoing part of their relationship. And when their spouse was no longer able to engage in these rich conversations, it almost felt like they were a different person. They weren't the same as they had been prior. Michael said, one thing that I missed was she was always able to have really good conversations and was a good sounding board. That's probably the number one missing thing. So feeling like I used to have this person I could talk to, and they're not there anymore in the same way. That was a really big relationship change that not only changed the relationship from spouse to caregiver, but almost made it feel like there was a different person there or someone who wasn't able to engage as they had previously. So this was really difficult. The next turning point was forgetting my name. This one is so hard to talk about. I think many of us who are familiar with dementia kind of have heard similar stories, but for those who experienced it, the moment when their spouse didn't remember their name for the first time was a really big turning point in their relationship. And really, again, that sense that this person who they've been in a relationship with for so many years was gone because they couldn't even remember their name anymore. And Jane told a story about when this happened for her. She took her husband to Trader Joe's, and they were shopping around, and he got separated from her. And this is what she told. She said, I could hear a frightened man just yelling, hey you, hey you. He didn't even know my name. And that's when it hit me how much I had progressed. Mm-hmm. So this was a devastating relationship change and a turning point that happened in many of these relationships. Now we know dementia works in kind of crazy ways. So sometimes they might remember the name, and other times they might not remember the name. But for many of them, the first time their spouse forgot their name, that was a pretty memorable, challenging turning point. And just kind of that sense that the person I loved isn't here anymore fully. They don't remember me in the way they had before. The final relationship turning point that kind of led to this change was altering living arrangements. So a lot of caregiving spouses talked about either moving to separate bedrooms at some point or moving their loved one into long-term care as being another turning point in their relationship. Now, for many of them, by the time they got to this space, they'd already experienced some of these other turning points, which means that the change in living arrangements was almost a physical manifestation of that change that had already occurred. So for many of them, they talked about she was already different. She was already not here in the same way, and now we're not even in the same space. So moving to a new space was a physical change that created an additional change in their relationship. Michael said, not sleeping in the same bed after 50 years, it was a major kind of thing in our relationship. So just that physical distance kind of, I would say, re-emphasized this change that they had already kind of experienced in their relationship. So let's look back at this turning points timeline. Oh, and I have it all grayed out, so that's not very helpful. If you can kind of see in gray, there's this general downward trajectory, which kind of maps this theme of loss that's in the dementia literature. In a lot of ways, they are experiencing relationship loss across the disease trajectory, across many turning points. But the last relationship change is, I think, kind of this like silver lining or the redeeming factor here. So I've called this change transcending dementia through love. And what you'll notice is there's no turning points that contribute to it, but it's something that came up in almost every interview I did. This idea, like Tom put on his timeline, nothing has made our relationship truly more distant. Or they would say things like, I have a different kind of love for my spouse, or a deeper and different type of love. So they would say these things to me. They would paint this picture of relational decline, all these challenging changes that were occurring, and then they would say something like, but I still love her as much as I always did. And so I just thought this was so fascinating and so beautiful, this idea they could transcend all of these challenges of dementia through the love that they had for their spouse, for the way that they continued to feel compassion, love, closeness to their spouse. And so let me give you an idea of what this looked like. And I will say, I call it a relationship change because many people talked about it as a different type of love in their relationship. It wasn't what they had before, it's different, but it was something that bound them together, something that made them feel close, and gave them this like continuance of care and closeness. So let me give you some examples. Tom said, I have felt more married and more in love with her than I did before the diagnosis. When something like this happens, it can be an agglomerator, it can be a glue. I feel we're still married, and there's certainly beauty in what is happening here. He talked about, getting up on the wedding day and saying till, in health and in sickness, till death do us part. And he talked about, what I'm doing here is I'm living my wedding vows. Like, this is the vow, I'm doing it. And he talked about how this act of being there for her in this really challenging time made him feel more married and more in love with her in a different way than he had before they experienced a challenge as hard as dementia. Annie said, in one sense, Alzheimer's has drawn us closer. Not in a romantic way. It's just drawn us closer to be more friends and more caring. We are true friends and soulmates. Mm-hmm. So again, this different type of love. There's this friendship that's here, and this soulmates, which seems maybe deeper than just the romance they might have had earlier in their relationship. And so dementia, or Alzheimer's, another form of dementia, was incredibly difficult. They did experience relational losses, but they were able to transcend those losses by having this new sense of love that they developed through providing care. Finally, Carol said, caring for him gives me satisfaction. It's loving him. So as if the act of care was the thing that was kind of creating some of this love in their relationships. So once I kind of found this relationship change, transcending dementia through love, I had to know, well, what are they doing to make this happen? How are they communicating with their loved ones? How do they talk with their spouse? What's making this transcending possible? So next I want to talk a little bit about the communication strategies that they engaged in. These caregiving spouses were pretty strategic about their communication and how they were communicating with their spouse in ways that facilitated this ongoing connection or sense of love. What I want to talk about was having open and intimate conversations. Now, these happen early in the disease trajectory. We're thinking like far on this side where those initial symptoms and diagnosis were occurring. In fact, many of them talked about the diagnosis being this beautiful entryway into intimate conversations. So the early symptoms were frustrating, confusing, caused conflict in the relationship. Getting the diagnosis allowed them to be candid and say, this is going to be hard, let's talk about it. These open conversations were so important for them to be able to sort of reaffirm the sense of love and care that they had in their relationship, and to sort of remind each other that they were in it together, that they could do it together, they would support each other. So Eleanor said, our conversations just kind of brought us together. We're all on the same page now. So prior to the diagnosis, they weren't on the same page necessarily, but being able to have the diagnosis and being able to talk about the diagnosis brought them together because they were on the same page in facing dementia. Jane said, talking about one of these conversations, she says, it was probably one of the most intimate conversations we've had. It gave us time to cement that closeness we had when we were first together, and I could assure him that I would never abandon him. And what's interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, Jane's spouse had died right before the interview. And so this conversation probably happened 8 years prior to the interview, and it was still something that she looked back on as being something that strengthened her in her relationship. So these were powerful conversations, important conversations. I'll say not everyone had them. The people who their spouses refused to have a diagnosis did not have conversations like this. But for those who were able to have a conversation, this was impactful and important for helping them maintain that connection and that closeness to their spouse throughout the disease trajectory. The next strategy was avoiding confrontation. We've talked a little bit about this, like stepping into their reality, not trying to force them. The caregiving spouses were very strategic about when do you engage and when do you work around it, and tried really hard to maintain, peace in the home, peace in the relationship, which makes sense in our own, even in our relationships outside of a dementia context, we try to engage in things that will keep the peace in our relationships. They were even more strategic about it with dementia because they knew that some of the symptoms or behaviors they were seeing were coming from dementia, not necessarily from their partners. So Annie said, he don't put his pajamas on no more. He sleeps in his clothes. I used to suggest, just put your pajamas on. Hell no. So I let him do that, It ain't no big deal no more. So making some adaptations. Okay, you don't want to sleep in your pajamas. Like, of all the things we could be fighting about, pajamas is probably pretty low on the rung. So she's like, okay, sleep in your clothes. That's okay. Similarly, Bella said, pick your battles. You know they don't want to shower at a certain time? Then wait. And don't fight over things that don't need to be fought over. You just have to be really flexible. And so they're here in this daily act of providing care. They're being really strategic about, okay, maybe I insist you take your medication at 9 a.m. because it has to be taken in the morning, but do you have to shower at 9 a.m.? Maybe not. Maybe you're in a better mood after lunch. Or you will not put on your pajamas. Okay, fine. You can sleep in your clothes if you want to do that. We don't have to fight over it. So they were strategic, and many of them mentioned the ways that if they had conflict, that just made everything worse for their spouse's symptoms, and I think we talked about that. Dr. Self talked about that a little bit as well. If they're getting upset or if there's a really frustrated, angry environment, that's not going to help their behavioral symptoms. So they were really strategic about making sure if they needed to push on something, it was really going to be worth it because for the most part, they could find ways to be flexible. The next strategy was avoiding bringing attention to the symptoms. Now, this wasn't just avoiding confrontation. These caregiving spouses were really strategic about protecting their partner from embarrassment or shame that they might feel from having the symptoms pointed out over and over again. And so they did this in a lot of ways. One way was writing letters to the doctor, like Dr. Self mentioned. They would write a report so they didn't have to talk about their spouse in front of them in a way that might hurt their feelings. And this is how they told me about it. Like, I wanted to protect her from embarrassment, so I wrote a report. They also did things like, okay, I know you can't handle this type of mail, pull out the bills, and you can take care of all the other mail. So giving them things that they could do so they didn't feel like they had problematic symptoms. They avoided the potholes, but gave them space where they could still act and do things they were capable of. Or maybe it was, you can see them struggling with something, you let them struggle until they ask for help. So instead of saying, I know you have problems, let me help you, letting them have the autonomy to work through something as much as they could and kind of setting up an environment where they could feel competent, they could do things without having the symptoms brought to their mind over and over again because they really wanted to protect their spouses from embarrassment or shame. I love this quote from Kevin. He said, every time she says, oh, I can't remember this, or you didn't tell me that, I say, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe I forgot to tell you. By saying that, I feel much closer to her, much more love. I don't want to create anything that's negative in her mind. So we can see this is not just to avoid confrontation, but this is sort of like a caring act of a spouse to protect their loved one. That you don't have to have the symptoms put before your face all the time. I'm going to protect you from feeling embarrassment where I can. I'm going to protect you from feeling ashamed through my strategic avoidance of bringing attention to these symptoms. The fourth strategy was engaging in daily conversations and activities. Now, these were not the same conversations and activities they had prior to dementia onset most of the time. Usually they were things they could do like simple games, listening to music, taking walks, or watching movies. And Robert, I love this term, he used the phrase positive joint experiences that they could share to help them maintain connection. So he said, she might not remember the movie, but we can go and have this positive joint experience together. And just like in all of our other relationships, having positive interactions with each other makes us feel more positive towards one another. So the act of being able to share something, even if it was simple, was something that helped them maintain that sense of connection or relationship with their spouse, sharing these positive joint experiences. Garth said, if I can get her to laugh and goof around, she'll laugh and I'll laugh, and maybe we'll get something out of this that can be funny. So in addition to finding these activities they could share, also finding things they could laugh about, finding things that they could laugh together about was really important. I think this one makes so much sense when we just think about all relationships. The people we laugh with, we usually like. The people we have positive experiences with, we usually like. And so they found ways they could continue to do this within the scope of dementia, within the symptoms that they were working with. Now, the final strategy I want to talk about is communicating love. And communicating love happened in all the normal ways we would think of, like saying I love you or holding hands. Carol said we exchange I love you often. It brings us closer when we do that. So being able to verbalize I love you, being able to hear back from the spouse when that happened was really meaningful for these spouses. Others talked about just being able to sit and hold hands. Some of them, their spouses were nonverbal by the end of their lifespan, but they could sit and hold hands, or they could make eye contact. And for the caregiving spouses I talked to, these were important, meaningful expressions of love. they also talked about the work that they did as caregivers as being expressions of love. So Tom described these as physical manifestations of care to communicate love. He said, I brush her hair and I cut her nails, and it's a way for me to love her and let her know that she's cared for. And so for the caregiving spouses who could view some of these really physical caregiving tasks as expressions of love, their caregiving became something that could help them feel closer to their spouse. And again, he's the one who talked about it being an agglomerator or a glue. This act of providing care for her in a way he'd never done prior to dementia was something that helped him feel a new sense of love and care for his spouse. So that's all the communication strategies I have for you. Let's kind of do takeaways. I didn't do learning objectives at the beginning, so we're going to do takeaways at the end. But the first one I think is just that Alzheimer's disease and other dementias impacts not just the patient, but very much all the people that they share relationships with, and particularly their spouse. Generally through life, the spouse is the person who's closest to us, and this certainly is true. And so when we're thinking about care, when we're thinking about supporting someone with dementia, I think we have to bring their spouses, their adult children, whoever is involved in their circle should be included in these conversations because they're deeply impacted by dementia, even if they're not experiencing symptoms themselves. The second is that the nature of the relationship changes with the symptoms of the disease. And so if we're thinking about supporting spouses and we're thinking about supporting couples who are impacted by dementia, we need to be thinking about where are they at currently in the disease trajectory. Are they in these early symptoms where there's frustration and anger? How might we work with that? Maybe a diagnosis is a good thing to address some of those problems. If they're needing to have conversations about driving, how can we facilitate those conversations in ways that will be helpful? Or maybe how can our physician step in? Maybe if there's changes with changing living arrangements, what are ways that we can reaffirm the relationship even when they're living in different spaces? So thinking about each point in the disease trajectory is going to be a different relational period that's experienced in different ways. And so how can we address each period according to the changes that we know might be happening in the relationship?